Inside the archives of the Temple of the Moon, the libraries hidden in the temple were extensive indeed, and no doubt there would be a lot more information as well that he would be able to get his hands on. Naturally, the alphabet was unknown to the Spartan, but he was able to get the chance to understand it later once he was done looking at them, as this would allow Cortana to gather the information. The Spartan pored over maps, pictures, scrolls and more while moving with relaxed patience and focus on each book and scroll that was located there in the library. He knew that there would be even more sources of information in the city that he would be able to look into at a much later date. Cortana was humming a classical song in her mind while she took in all the information with a smile and filing it all away, her now freed brain being more than enough to help with the task. John was naturally not alone in the library, as none other than Kaelin and Tyrande were there in the library. The two night elves were currently observing the Spartan who stood as he pored through the books, maps, and scrolls, looking for a few minutes to half an hour or so before moving to the next one. Kaelin then spoke to the High Priestess. High Priestess, what do you think of him? Tyrande sighed a bit and replied. The chief, as he prefers to be recognized as, is a very interesting being. He might come from a society that does not know anything about magic, but he is quite capable. Jared's description of his battle skills are proof of that, and what we have seen adds further weight to his story. As for him personally, I do not know. He certainly is a dangerous being, of that there is no doubt, but he seems to be sincere about his desire to be left alone. Kaelin nodded at that as the two of them watched as the Spartan continued to pore through the tomes and scrolls before him, and this time, they had no doubt that the glowing female being that was with him was helping the Spartan. The moment the being known as Cortana revealed herself to Tyrande and the others in the temple with a smile was actually the most shocking part of the whole discussion, as they had never seen anything like her before. She was like Wisp, yet she was not a dead being or a spirit, but in her own words a program, a being made of information created by humans from this UNSC that the Spartan was part of. That was how the discussion started, but at that same time, there was also Fandral, who spoke seriously about the fact that the Spartan was wearing such armor, and he demanded that the chief removed his helmet. The sight that greeted her and the other night elves was something that she was not going to forget easily. Horizontal ellipsis. Flashback. The Spartan seemed hesitant for a moment until Cortana faded away back into his armor, and then, after another moment or two, the Spartan removed his helmet with a snap and a hiss. Needless to say, the night elves there in the temple who were female were surprised to suddenly see that the Spartan was indeed human, namely Kaelin, as she had been expecting him to be many things once he revealed himself to them. He could have been some sort of demon underneath the armor, a living being of death and carnage as she had seen from him, a battle-scarred warrior whose visage spoke of death just from a glance, many things in her mind, just not this. The chief was pale, almost to the point of being an albino, and yet, he didn't seem to have any weaknesses, to say the very least. In fact, the man seemed to be at the peak of health. Kaelin knew enough about male humans to see that the Master Chief was actually quite handsome, strong, well-chiseled features without any flaws at all. He had brown hair that was cut in what seemed like a military-style haircut, which seemed to actually suit him, as it gave him the aura of a veteran soldier, which he no doubt was to begin with. His skin, while pale, was also flawless and didn't have any facial hair at all on his face, and the most telling was his eyes. His eyes were deep brown and they glowed in an inner fire that seemed to be cool and calm at the moment, but there was no denying the power that was hidden there in those brown orbs. His gaze was also very different from a normal human. It was calculating, intense, focused, with hints of sadness, absolute confidence, as well as patience. The eyes of a man who would study you carefully, taking in full detail of your whole being, the kind any woman would be feeling pleasant shivers if he was. Kaelin quickly shook her head mentally to focus on other things. As soon as that was done, the Spartan turned to the Archdruid and calmly replied. So does that satisfy your curiosity? Fandral seemed to be silent as he gazed at the Spartan and then nodded as he spoke. It does. Now then, where are you from? The Spartan then placed his helmet right back on, and his face was soon hidden under a snap and hiss as the seals for the Mjolnir Mark VI sealed the helmet once more. Horizontal ellipsis. End of flashback. Tyrande recalled that and smiled a bit as she spoke. For a supposed demon, he looked rather nice to thee. I can tell that you were affected, Sentinel Nightwalker. Kaelin blushed a bit and nodded. She was indeed affected by the appearance of the Spartan without the helmet and faceplate to hide his features, and she had no doubt that she was not the only female in the temple affected by it. Tyrande gently laughed to herself and then looked at the Spartan as he seemed focused on gathering the information that he came to get from their archives. As she gazed at him, The high priestess began to recall the conversation about the UNSC as both the Spartan and his companion Cortana revealed the information about the UNSC, which Cortana revealed as she used her updated holographic BIOS to create holograms that took over the whole room of the first level of the temple. Horizontal ellipsis. Flashback. Needless to say, she and her fellow night elves, surprised by the images they saw that Cortana began to provide for them as she gathered the information she had stored away, though she had decided to leave behind the information of the Halo Ariane. The Forerunners for now, as this was considerably sensitive information and would best be kept hidden away from anyone, even their potential allies the Night Elves. After all, the knowledge that somewhere in this galaxy, if it was possible, were weapons that could purge the entire galaxy of all living things would prove to be rather troubling to the people of this world. The data that the AI had shown them was the history of the UNSC in the beginning, though the AI withheld the name of the UNSC core home world of Earth or its exact location, along with any other data that by UNSC standards was considered eyes only. The images highlighted the expansion of the UNSC from Earth and the development of the slip space drive, which was something that was a lot harder to explain than most. But John and Cortana finally explained that it was a technological equivalent to a portal made by magic. The Night Elves watched as the humans of the UNSC began to build what in their eyes was a ship in the very sea of stars. As the Night Elves watched the UNSC build their colonies and their fleets in the very void of the stars, it was naturally shocking to think that humans who had no knowledge of magic could be able to do such feats and accomplish such things that to the Night Elves, in fact to the whole races of Azeroth, was something only the Draenei were able to do. And to their amazement, instead of destroying whole tracts of land for their own needs, the humans of this UNSC were able to actually live a life that was in balance with nature, as there were still beautiful lands and forests around their cities. The Spartan continued to explain to them how the UNSC developed the technology they had, and the Night Elves finally saw their fleets and armies. The reaction of the Night Elves to the sight of the odds was a bit shocking. And that was natural, as not everyone saw soldiers drop from the very sky in the same devices he had used to land on their world and come out in armor that was unlike what they had seen before. The UNSC Army and the UNSC Marine Corps were also surprising, as they had never seen the kinds of gear that these human men and women used. The Night Elves were also surprised to see the kinds of vehicles and weapons the UNSC soldiers used in battle. Kaelin was no stranger to the effectiveness of such weapons in battle, and Tyrande had been told about how deadly those weapons were thanks to Jared showing the memories of the battle through magic. Both women and just about all the others in the temple were very much surprised and worried about the sheer carnage such weapons could bring into the field of battle, as well as in deep space when the UNSC warships went to war. Naturally, Tyrande was very serious about her next question, and that was why the people in the Master Chief's reality would rely on such weapons and technology to wage wars. The Spartan then replied that they had faced enemies that would warrant such weaponry, and even though the Night Elves thought that these weapons were destructive, the weapons and forces of their enemies were even worse. Their enemy was a collection of races united by religion and faith, calling themselves the Covenant. However, he replied that he would need to keep that information a bit more secret, since he was not sure how the Night Elves would react to the images that they were going to see if he showed it all to them. That was when Fandral spoke out. "We have faced the very wrath of the Burning Legion and the encroachment of our lands by the lesser races, as well as the predations of the Scourge and countless other threats, as well as that traitor Illidan and his hordes of Naga. How can your enemies equal that?" The Spartan looked at everyone else in the room and decided that since they were serious about this, he decided to show them one of the key battles in the UNSC Covenant War, and it was just one of the first battles that was soon to follow. He however told them that what they were about to see was going to be very disturbing. Fandral snorted at that, and both Kaelin and Sandra as well as Jared and the Night Elves looked on. The Spartan showed them a beautiful world known as Helios 017, one of the colonized worlds, and what they were told were the outer colonies of the UNSC. The capital city of New Athens was located there, and it was a very large and bustling metropolis with a large population numbering at last 3 million people, young and old. It had a heavy marine and army garrison force of at least 50,000 soldiers, complete with everything that they would need, as well as a small but mobile orbital defense fleet. It did them nothing as the Covenant came in for the first time. The Night Elves were shown just what was happening as the Covenant descended on the city of New Athens. In moments, the Spartans' records showed the UNSC fighting their best to keep the Covenant forces from descending on the planet's surface, but the Covenant ships which were pointed out by the Spartan were able to brush the ships aside. And soon the battle was about to begin as more UNSC ships from frigates to destroyers and even the massive cruisers came on site to fight as the Spartan and his own team of Spartans were well on their way to the surface to aid the exhausted and shell-shocked survivors. The city that was once rather massive and beautiful even the Night Elf standards was now turned into a hellish place, building reduced to rubble, fires were everywhere. Trails of glowing energy flew as the UNSC flying machines shown to be short swords. Long swords and hornets were waging a brutal aerial war with Covenant air forces which was somewhat the same as when the aerial mounts of the Alliance and Horde would fight another, but those mounts were replaced by machines instead. While those forces clashed and fought with sheer ferocity over the now blackened skies, the once massive towers of the city were now torn and ruined as fires and smoke filled the sky. The Night Elves found themselves unable to move as they looked at the images before them and around them. The battle in space was shocking enough. But as soon as the Spartan and his companions hit the surface of the now-ravaged city and hearing the Spartan give his orders, they finally saw the real carnage on the ground. All around them were buildings that were ruined and blackened, vehicles upturned and burning, the screams of the living were there as well, and then they saw the bodies of the humans of this UNSC. All around the Spartan and his comrades were people, twisted and mutilated to take brutal parodies of the human body's ability to move. Literal rivers of blood were flowing everywhere before their eyes, and there were pools of it as well. The bodies of young children, teenagers, and adults filled the streets and the ruined buildings, many of them sporting horrific wounds, some had limbs and even heads removed, their innards revealed in the harsh light of combat. It was not limited to just civilians, as soldiers wearing UNSC body armor and carrying weapons were there, their bodies bleeding heavily from severe wounds. Others were burned by plasma fire that parts of their bodies had sometimes been scorched to the point that they were hardly recognizable. All throughout the city were the screams of the dying, the wounded, and those who were killed without mercy. The record stopped and showed a lone Marine being interrogated by a lone Sangheili Ultra who was surrounded by a number of jackals who were chattering hungrily. Their bloodthirsty eyes glued to the wounded Marine as he was being held up by his neck by his captor, his right arm hanging on through a few strands of skin and flesh while a river of blood flowed down his legs. Cortana then increased the volume of the recording and zoomed the image to make the whole thing larger for all to see. You fought well for such a weak thing, heretic. You humans have true courage and honor to fight us even if your death is the will of the gods. Know that we are not without mercy. I shall grant you a swift and painless death. The Marine, his face twisted in pain and hatred, his name being shown as Corporal Franklin Dallas, spat back at the elite. Go to hell, you split-lipped Xeno bastard. The Sangheili gave a sound that was like a laugh and its mandibles were in a form of a smile as it spoke. Even as you face death, you fight with all of your will and soul. You humans truly are impressive despite being weak. I shall indeed give you death, death by the sword. With that, the Sangheili took out a handle that Kalen and Jared recognized as an energy sword and then, the Night Elves there looked on as the elite stabbed the weapon right through the Marine's body armor and through him. They heard Franklin's screams of pain for a moment until his head rolled down and showed that he was dead. And then to their shock, the elite tossed the dead human's body aside. Only for the jackals to suddenly charge at Franklin's body and begin to eat him. Byalun. The recording changed images, showing that the Spartans were now on the move, but Tyrion spoke out and her words were stern and serious, though she was showing that she was doing her best not to lose her composure. How could you and your fellow soldiers leave that man to die like that? Why didn't you try and save him? The Spartan could see that the same questions were in the faces of all the Night Elves. Even Fandral was confused as to why he had not helped the wounded and helpless Marine. In your world, High Priestess Tyrande, you can wipe out a patrol and you would have plenty of time to do what you need before they are missed by their allies back in the base. In mine, our technology and that of the Covenant, can shorten that to mere moments. If we attacked, they would have warned their companions and their defenses would be much harder to break into, they would be harder to surprise and in turn take out. No one, least of all me, wanted that man to die the way he did, but it was either his life, or that of many others in the city. It's hard and cruel, but that is something one must live with. The Night Elves were stunned, but any complaint they had died as they saw the truth there. Tyrande herself recalled how some of her sisters gave their lives so others might live. She understood that and as such, she spoke no more as the images continued to play before her. Eventually the Spartans were able to meet up with the survivors of the garrisons and soon began to gather what they could in order to fight to allow the survivors to escape from their now doomed homeworld. The Night Elves watched as the Spartans gathered what they could alongside the surviving soldiers and move out. They even salvaged whatever weapons and ammunition they could find from their dead comrades. Tyrande was horrified by the carnage before her, to know that in only half a day, nearly all of the people in that city were slaughtered like sheep, and even their best soldiers on the ground could do little to stop the incoming advance. What had once been two different groups that had nearly 100,000 soldiers and so much firepower were cut down to less than 100 each in only half a day. The idea of such slaughter on a scale like this nearly made her vomit, something that she had never done before in her life. She looked to her left and she saw for a moment the body of a human child, a little girl, no more than 6, her eyes gripped in terror and death, her mouth opened in a scream but her throat was cut as blood flowed through her mouth and throat. Her body showed signs of being gnawed upon by beasts. The handiwork of the bloodthirsty jackals. The sight sent waves of revulsion through her as she looked at the child's terror-stricken face. She looked to her right and saw a dead member of the UNSC army with his left arm blown off below the elbow, his eyes closed and blood streaming out from the gouges of his burned body armor with his right hand clutching his assault rifle in death. Some distance behind him was a woman who had been gunned down and a massive series of burns on her back showed that she had been shot as she tried to flee, a pool of blood around her while the soldier had died trying to save her. That however changed when the Spartan and his soldiers finally engaged the Covenant. The Night Elves watched as they watched the Spartans and his comrades fight with their foes in the records as they all looked at the Covenant races as Cortana explained them one by one, from the Ungoi or the Grants, to the Sangheili or the Elites, the Kijira or the Jackals, and the Mgalak Galo or the Hunters. The battles that erupted between the UNSC were undeniably brutal as several human survivors were slain in the most violent manner possible while the Covenant races were also slain by the soldiers of the UNSC as the Spartans moved like shadows or avatars of warfare as Covenant soldiers fell before the chief and his comrades. The screams and curses filled the air, human and alien in a symphony of unmatched destruction and bloodshed. It was like reliving the bloodiest battles, yet they were not part of the whole thing. The Night Elves in the temple found themselves in the record, even if they could not smell the flames, the stench of flesh being burned, or hear the sounds of fighting and dying around them. They felt like they were indeed in a real situation. All of this reminded Tyrande of the first slaughter at Suramur so long ago. This was the only time she had ever been reminded of that day, and she couldn't help but feel sickened once more. This battle went on until the Spartans were forced to evacuate all the civilians that were still alive as well as the surviving soldiers from the area as the Covenant fleet were now unleashing their full might to reduce the world below them into nothing but a glass mess. Cortana explained it all as the Night Elves watched in horror as the once verdant and lush planet that would have easily been an ideal home for their people and the order races of Azeroth was reduced into a hellish wasteland by the Covenant. After this, Tyrande was speechless and looked at the Spartan with hard eyes. She had seen the carnage of the war with the Burning Legion nearly 10,000 years ago during the Great Sundering and then when the Legion came again after the Alliance and Horde arrived. She was no stranger to bloodshed and death, but seeing warfare of this level, in this brutality was utterly shocking to her and she couldn't help but try her very best to fathom just how could it be like this. Is this how wars were fought on your worlds? John replied that what they saw was not the war, but a battle, one among hundreds that would last for over 30 years, resulting in 299 other worlds being subjected to the same fate as Helios. That was utterly disturbing to the Night Elves. So much slaughter in different worlds and in such a scale, they had seen the devastating power of magic, but to see such wars where magic never existed and it was in this level of brutality. It was very difficult and disturbing indeed to them. That was then that Fandral spoke. How long have you been in this war with this Covenant? John then replied. I have been fighting them ever since I was 14 by human standards. Jared was wide-eyed at that and so were everyone else, as Tyrande spoke once more. You have been fighting them since you were that young? Yes. By all accounts I am already 41 years of age but thanks to UNSC medicine and technology, I can live a lot longer than most humans. But the Covenant was not the only enemy we had to fight, there was something worse hidden in the shadows, one could call it. No more. I beg you, by the mercy of Elune to stop these images. The Spartan could see the distress in the face of the High Priestess and decided to agree but not before he told them of the end of the war where the lies of the prophets finally were revealed, and how the Sangheili revolted for the betrayal of their race by their former leaders and how they fought side by side to finally end the conflict. Tyrande decided that all that she had seen was too much for her to handle in one day and that was why she spoke out and decided to end the discussion for now about where the Spartan came from. However, she was not done as she spoke to him once more. After all that fighting and bloodshed, how could you not have become maddened by all of this slaughter? John could tell that this was important for her and he replied, "My fellow Spartans and I were trained to fight and endure, to fight through everything and win. I and my brothers and sisters were once trained to stop rebellion, but when the Covenant came, we were the ones who fought to save every human life we could. We were in a war not for land, riches, honor, faith, freedom, or any of the sort. We were fighting for the most basic right, the right to live. That was why no matter what happened, there were other soldiers who never gave up. Those soldiers refused to lie down and die, because they knew that they were the ones to defend those who could not fight back." Tyrande was silent. She looked at the Spartan and marveled that someone like him was able to survive the level of fighting she had seen with her two eyes. That added further weight to what she had seen from Jared's magical sphere as well as his report. That was when she recalled something that she had heard from the records. "What exactly are you? I at least understand from what I have seen that this title you have is your rank and you are a member of the Navy of your UNSC, but what does Spartan mean? Is it your true name or does it have a different meaning? You were called that by your human allies many times, and even called demon by these Covenant. Why is that?" The Spartan thought about it and replied, "The term Spartan is in honor of the soldiers of the same name. The term Spartan was given to the residents of the city-state of Sparta in ancient Greece on Earth. The Spartans were an ultramilitaristic nation where all the male population is trained to be soldiers. Every male child born is examined and tested extensively. Those who are shown to be sickly or physically deformed are abandoned to die. The Night Elves were surprised and revolted by that, but they held their words and waited for the Master Chief to finish. Those who pass are taken into the barracks at the age of 7 and are trained to be soldiers under the watch of veteran Spartan soldiers. They are given little food and have to forage and steal to make up for that, learning how to fight and survive, and are punished for being caught, not for stealing. Once they were older, they were required to serve in the army of Sparta until they were 30 years of age to become citizens of Sparta itself. The Spartans are all citizen warriors, trained to endure, survive, and obey without question, and fight with all they have to the end. They are required to marry at 20 but cannot be with their families until they reach the age of citizenship. They are trained to fight as a unit and all of them treat one another as fellow equals. In the end, they left behind no great works, stories, and stonework, but they left behind a legacy that endured for over 4,000 years in the history of mankind. Long ago, the Persian Emperor Xerxes began an invasion of the Greek city-states, gathering an army that had soldiers from half the known world under his empire's sway. The Greeks marshaled a defense in response, with the first being a naval blockade to keep the Persian navy from attacking, while the Spartan king Leonidas gathered 300 of his Spartan royal guard, those with living sons, to continue their lines, along with support soldiers, and marched to a pass known as Thermopylae. There he and his soldiers, along with 5,000 other Greek soldiers, to form an army of 7,000 against Xerxes' forces that numbered a full 225,000. Tyrande listened intently along with the other night elves, and even the normally arrogant Fandral remained silent. For 2 days, the Spartans and their fellow Greeks fought on, using the terrain and location to their advantage as well as their equipment and training. They inflicted nearly 25,000 losses to the Persians, forcing the Persians to walk over the bodies of their comrades and wade through the blood-soaked lands. Eventually they were betrayed when a sheep herder, seeing a chance to become rich at the expense of his fellow Greeks, told the Persians of a pass that allowed them to surround the Greeks. The Greeks knew there and then that they were finished. Leonidas then ordered the Greeks to leave and regroup while he and his Spartans remained to cover the retreat. They were not alone, as 700 soldiers from the city-state of Thebes stayed with them to fight to the end. On the last day, the Persians attacked in full force and the Spartans and their allies fought like men possessed, for they knew that every minute they spent fighting would be another minute that their allies could regroup, resupply, and prepare for the counter-attack. The battle lasted nearly an entire day as the Spartans and their allies fought with spears. When those failed, they used swords, until they used their hands and teeth. Tyrande then spoke the question in her mind. "And what happened to the Greeks who remained behind?" The Spartan replied with all seriousness. "Dead to the last man, Leonidas himself was brought before Xerxes, who in a rage for the loss of his forces and 2 of his brothers had the dead Spartan king's head cut off and placed on a pike while his body was mutilated. But the Spartans and their allies did what they had set out to do. What was by all rights a defeat turned into a powerful victory, as they had not only cost the Persian army much in terms of time, supplies and manpower, but they had broken the fighting spirit of the Persians, as they were terrified of fighting the full might of the Spartan army, for if 300 Spartans could do this much to them, what would happen if they faced a full army? I and those like me are named in honor of those soldiers." As for the title demon, it's fitting since I and my fellow Spartans have inflicted numerous casualties upon them many times and even destroyed a sacred place to their faith as well. Tyrant took it all in and she thought deeply on the things she had learned and then asked her question. Now that you have told us this information, I must know something from you that is important to me. I must know what your plans are while you are here in the lands of my people. If you are to be here, I need to know your full intentions so I can make a proper decision regarding your stay in our lands. Horizontal ellipsis. End of flashback. Tyrant looked out the window to see the rest of the city of Darnassus and was deep in thought after all she had seen from the records of this Spartan. It was still hard for her to grasp it all, but she could sense that all that she had seen was not some illusion. Why she felt that was beyond her for now, but there was no doubt that this man before her was not of this world. And as such was a very powerful being in his own right and was to be treated with respect. She also felt a moment of kinship with the man before her. He too was a warrior like her and had fought for his people just as she had for hers and gave everything to defend them just as she did. That was why in the end of the discussion between them, she listened to his words carefully as he stated that he had no intention of fighting for anyone on this world until he found out more of this world and its people. He naturally would defend himself if attacked, but he was not here to start a war with anyone, and as such, he was going to focus more on securing his location and do what he could in order to be rescued if possible by those of the UNSC. If not, he would find another way back home. Only when he learned all that he needed of this world that he had landed in would he finally make a decision on his stance towards the world and its people. Fandral naturally objected in having the Spartan in their lands, of course, despite seeing the images from the Spartan's memories. He still did not trust the Spartan and then left, vowing that he would watch the Spartan carefully despite Tyrant's stern warning to leave the Master Chief alone. She wished that her beloved Malfurion was here with her to guide her and give her the stability and support she longed for, as well as help her in keeping her people together. Not to mention for him to take back his rightful place as Archdruid of their people, as Fandral's actions have troubled her long before the Spartan ever came to their world. Fandral was an excellent druid, of that there was no doubt, having been Malfurion's lieutenant for a long time. However, his temperament was not one would expect from the right hand of Malfurion Stormrage. He was hot-tempered, prone to rash decisions, and also very much a traditional night elf who dislikes the alliances with those he deems as inferior races. Fandral believed that their race were the only true druids in Azeroth, as well as the superior race, as they had defeated the Legion without any aid in the past, and he believed that with time, they could do so again, despite the evidence on the contrary. Added to that was his belief that the only way for the Night Elves to grow in strength and power was through expansionist actions as well as military force. That, coupled with his aggressive stance, made him clash with her in more than one instance. It still made her wonder why was it that Malfurion had such a person as his right hand, as they also clashed on many matters in more than one moment in the time she had known the two. Fandral of course had suffered the loss of his son Valston in the War of the Shifting Sands many years before, so some of his anger towards other races was understandable. However, today his actions continued to grow more and more radical, and Tyrant worried that sooner or later, there would a civil crisis among her people if this kept on occurring. Only those high up in both their respective orders knew how violent their clashing of words was getting, and it was only a matter of time before things could radically change. Unknown to her, the Master Chief had some idea as to what was going on when Fandral and Tyrant spoke to one another. While he had no experience with politics and politicians, he knew a power struggle when he saw and heard one. The two had been arguing in Darnashan, unaware that Cortana's translation program had told the Spartan everything. As soon as Cortana had finished cataloging the information several hours later, she spoke to the Spartan and told him that now that they were done, they might as well look at the city and see the sights before they would head back to the Dawn and secure it even more for the day. The Spartan naturally argued with her on that regard as they had a private conversation. Cortana, you realize that I dislike being out in public. True, but we can gather even more information from out there as well as the temple. This being the Night Elves' capital would mean that there's plenty of people who come here to trade, plus getting more information will be helpful. Besides, you can try to be more sociable with our hosts. After what they've seen, I think showing them that you're not a demon is a good idea. John could tell that Cortana was dead serious about this and sighed once more as he spoke back to her. All right, but I'm only doing this because you asked for it. I might not like it at all, but if it'll make you happy then fine. Cortana laughed gently and replied. You can be a nice guy when you want to be. John then asked permission to tour the city before he returned to his ship, and Tyrande nodded at that as she gave him permission to see the rest of the city of Darnassus while under escort, of course, and before she could react. Kaelin was then told by the High Priestess to act as the Spartan's guide. Kaelin sighed and nodded as she began to guide the Spartan through the city of her people, showing him the various locations of the city, and along with him were Sandra and Jared. All the while, John had been studying the city itself and saw a good deal of things there in the city and began to record it in. He studied the exact layout of the city while listening to Kaelin as she told him about the various sections of the city. Naturally, the residents were more than willing to point at the Spartan and talk in their native tongue, which by now the Spartan understood well enough. Some of the people were wondering what he was, where did he come from, all those sorts of things, and some would even wonder if he was a demon. Some of that amused Cortana, but he ignored it. They stopped at the warriors' terrace as the Spartan watched the warriors there spar, and while he still had his helmet on, Kaelin looked at him, still trying her best to picture him without the helmet once more. It was also hard to imagine that he was already in his 40s when he looked to be a young man in the prime of life. The Night Elf Sentinel realized what she was doing and quickly shook her head and turned to see that Sandra saw her actions and her friend was grinning at her knowingly. Both were unaware that Cortana had seen that. She found it interesting as well as amusing and decided to tell the Master Chief about it at a later date. As soon as they were done, he returned to the temple and bid Tyrande farewell, but that was when the High Priestess spoke about something of great importance. Before you return to your ship, Spartan, I would like it if you have a guide or guides to help you get further acquainted to the lands of my people. This way you will know where you are as well as know what are the other denizens here in Kalimdor, whether benevolent or not. Since you are familiar with only Kaelin Nightwalker and Jared Moonleaf, I wish to ask if you do not mind them being by your side to help you while you are here in our lands? The Spartan looked at the two night elves and weighed the options. Both of them had exceptional knowledge and they were more familiar to him than anyone else for the matter. It was better to work with people who know of already, so you can watch them carefully as well as gain information from at the same time. He then gave his answer to that. I don't mind, but I have to point out that I will be traveling this land to learn more once I have secured my place of operations. If that happens, I want to know if they are alright with traveling with me to areas beyond Kalimdor. I may also travel to the lands of the Horde as well as meet the other races on this world of yours, so I need to be sure that they are alright with that. Or will they decide to stay here when I leave and return to their duties as sentinels until I return? Tyrande looked at both night elves and the silence was there. This was something that had to be considered well. Kaelin and Jared had never left Kalimdor's shores before, and this was not new. Many night elves preferred to stay in the lands they knew as home, and while many have gone beyond the shores, both of them were sentinels and were duty-bound to stay in Kalimdor to defend the land. Jared, however, spoke first. I will be willing to go if that is all right with you, High Priestess. Though I know little of the lands beyond Kalimdor, I am willing to go to those lands if I have your approval. Tyrande nodded and the druid smiled. In truth, hearing about the lands beyond Kalimdor in the past had stirred curiosity in the druid, and he was eager to see these lands. After all, he had heard rumors that both Malfurion and Tyrande had gone to the lands beyond, and he wished to see what they have seen as well. Tyrande then turned to Kaelin and asked her if she was willing to leave the lands of Kalimdor. What of you, Kaelin? I don't know, I have never considered traveling beyond Kalimdor. That was when Sandra spoke out. High Priestess, may I speak? Tyrande nodded and Sandra replied. I have already traveled beyond the lands of Kalimdor, and I have been to the lands inhabited by the humans and those of the other members of the Alliance, and those who are not part of the Horde, and even the lands inhabited by the Horde. If it will be with your approval, I will join this group alongside Kaelin, since I know the lands beyond Kalimdor well, and I will be able to help both my kindred adjust to living outside of our homeland. Tyrande thought it over and knew that Sandra was telling the truth, and she also knew that Kaelin and Sandra were friends when they were in the Sentinels. It would be better that both Kaelin and Jared had one of their own who had already gone beyond their lands with them to help them adjust as well if the Spartan left the lands. With that in mind, she spoke to Kaelin once more. I agree with that suggestion from Sister Sandra. What of you, Kaelin? The Night Elf Sentinel thought it over and decided that maybe she could do that. It would be a first to her, but if her best friend could do it, then what was stopping her from doing the same thing? Besides, she still was honor-bound to keep watch on the Spartan, and if doing so meant traveling with him beyond Kalimdor, then so be. Though she wondered why a tiny part of her mind called her a liar. I agree to that, High Priestess. If it will help our people, then I will go with the Spartan wherever he may go. Tyrion smiled at that, and as soon as everything had been done, the Spartan recovered his weapons with her approval, and as soon as he was done, they moved out to return to the village of Ruthurin and get back to his pelican. When he and the others got there to the pelican, the three had to ask a number of curious night elf children and some young teens to leave the pelican along and allow the Spartan to activate the code to have the pelican remove the lockdown that it was in. As soon that was done, the pelican was soon powering up its systems and moving out as the Spartan was focusing on the need to get back to the Dawn and make the needed changes to make sure that the ship was going to be much easier to defend. It was going to be a long amount of work that was going to be done in order to secure the ship as well as set up the much needed defenses. He had enough supplies as well as the support of the robotic rovers, and he could use the materials that were available to him around as well, though he made sure to check the inventory of the Dawn to see if the supplies were indeed enough. Horizontal ellipsis. As the pelican came closer to the Dawn's location, Sandra was currently talking to Jared and Kaylin to learn just what they knew of the Spartan and getting a feel for the pelican, compared to the zeppelins she had ridden before as well as the hippogriffs and the griffins. The pelican didn't allow for the feel of the wind, but it seemed to have some sort of device that kept the air cool and comfortable. Not to mention the flight seemed very fast compared to the zeppelins. The atmosphere was broken when Cortana suddenly appeared, and she had a very serious expression on her face as she spoke directly to the Spartan. John, we have a problem. The scanner networks we established around the Dawn have picked up a large number of figures moving towards the Dawn, along with 3 large ones, about the size of ogres. Instantly the Spartan got his full focus on the situation before him just as the conversation between the night elves was cut short as they also went over to see what was happening before them right now. Cortana was soon able to get a visual, and soon the AI revealed the video feed from some of the sensors they had left behind to act as a security measure. The figures were beings that were very short. Some were 2 feet and 7 inches, while others were 4 feet and 3 inches. They had long and sharp noses, chins, and ears as well. Some of the creatures had deep green skin while others had yellow-green skin. Their arms were rather long as well as their fingers. Some had no hair while others had hair in long ponytails. Others had punk-style hairdos and even mohawks from the looks of it. They were very odd-looking creatures in the eyes of the AI and the Spartan, though they were able to see that these creatures were well armed, at least by this world's standards, as some of them wore high-quality leather armor with metal pieces and carried a number of crossbows as well as a number of odd-looking devices that seemed to be similar to firearms, which was interesting for the Master Chief and Cortana, along with maces, short swords, and from what they could see, grenade-like weapons that might have explosives of some sort. Cortana naturally spoke out her thoughts on these uninvited guests. What are those things? Kaylin was not happy with what she was seeing as she recognized the creatures as she looked at the incoming images from the scanner systems that the Spartan had placed before. Those are goblins. John turned to face the night elf sentinel and spoke. You know them? Kaylin nodded and replied. Yes, the goblins are former members of the Horde in the old days from what I have heard, but now they serve both sides. They dabble in trade, commerce, and business. However, they do not hesitate to dabble in less than honest actions such as deforestation, slavery, strip mining, poaching, and more. We do not trust them nor have love for their race because they care only for making profit and power at the expense of the environment and of the suffering of others. Sandra then replied as she looked at the goblins more closely, marveling at the images before her, which has not being done with the aid of magic. And it's worse since those goblins are part of the Venture Trading Company. This bunch are very much a serious threat in the Barrens since they've been strip mining and deforesting Stone Talon Peak. The Tauren have tried to reason with them, but they don't seem to care much and continue on with their work. That has become a source of conflict for them and the Tauren from what I understand of it when I visited the Tauren once on a hunting trip. They are notorious and have a lot of ties with other groups like them. I heard that they were trading a type of poison to the Defious Brotherhood in the land of Azareth. They also have other branches of their group in other parts of the 2 continents as well. Cortana spoke to the hunter curiously. How do you know so much about them? I have my encounters with them. They are hostile to just anyone they meet, but most especially to us night elves and the Tauren. However, I can't figure out why they would be willing to come to our lands of all places. I can wager a guess, they might be after the Dawn. The Spartan growled at what Cortana said and he vowed that they were going to regret it. He checked his weapons and prepared for battle. Horizontal ellipsis. The goblins chatted among themselves eagerly as they were moving through the forest, unaware that their movements were being tracked by the Spartan and his AI companion. They had come this close to the Night Elves' lands with a number of their forces to try and see if the giant falling star that their spies reported days before was still there. They had wondered if there was any good ore that could prove useful for them to sell or use for their own ends. With them were a number of slaves that they had taken to use as support labor as well as being the pack mules. Some were getting old, but what can they do at this time with what they have? They were going to see if the ore from that star will be worth some more extra coins in the market. There were sudden cries from the slaves as one of the nearby orc guards whipped them while shouting in common, "Move faster, you slugs!" The goblins and their group finally reached the end of the forest line after swearing that the trees here would be worth cutting down for lumber. But what they saw next was more than enough to drive the thought of the rich lumber of northern Kalimdor in the market out of their minds. They spotted the dawn, and despite the distance before them they were able to get a good glimpse of the UNSC frigate. The goblins were quick to realize that they had just stumbled on something that could be a very rich haul. While they had no idea what was before them, the goblins were more than willing to go out and see for themselves. However, just as they were approaching the dawn, a rain of missiles suddenly came right at them. The goblins in the front of the advancing scores of their kindred only had enough time to cry out as they were quickly destroyed in a heartbeat in a fiery explosion that was more than enough to halt the goblins dead in their tracks. The creatures began to chatter wildly at this sudden and unexpected attack on their comrades and looked to see something flying towards them at high speed. They quickly raised their weapons and quickly fired at the incoming object, only to find that their weapons were not able to reach it. Horizontal ellipsis. I smirked and replied, "They really should know that their weapons aren't going to be of much use if we're at this height. Their guns don't even have the range, though I am curious as to how they have guns in the first place." John, however, was all business as he looked at the data coming into the Pelican's monitor. "Save that for later. Inquiry for later, Cortana. Just how many are still left? Apart from the dozen we just reduced to nothing, I could at least a full 3 dozen more, but I am picking up other signatures that are clustered together. They happen to be way back in the rear of this attack force though. The 5th group is fairly large, but they seem to be separate from the main force, along with 3 other signatures, very large ones at that." "Ogres?" Cortana shook her head. "Not if they happen to be made out of metal for some reason. I'm also picking up some abnormal temperature settings from the 3, but I can't get a good visual on them just yet." "Right, Cortana, guide the Pelican and be my eyes in the sky. I'm going down." Kaelin and the others watched as the doors of the Pelican opened up and she spoke to him. "Wait, we are still in the air. Are you planning to jump out?" The Spartan only had one answer to that. "Exactly. Horizontal ellipsis." The goblins who were still shooting at the Pelican dropship got the shock of their lives when something that resembled a human figure came out from being the flying object and seemed to be heading right before them as the Pelican flew overhead. The Pelican was a good 10 stories up in the air, but that was hardly a troubling distance for the Spartan 2 as he hit the ground with enough force to actually send shockwaves into the ground as well as a large amount of dirt and more into the air. The goblins were surprised at this sudden change as they tried to see what had come out from that flying machine. The debris fell down and they got to see the Spartan 2 himself as John got from his kneeling position and smoothly took out his MA5 CICWS assault rifle from his back and was now carrying it both hands. The goblins had enough time to raise their weapons to fire at the Spartan 2, but they were not going to get far as the Spartan was quickly firing away, killing them and sending blood, flesh, and guts flying all over the place as their leather armor proved to be useless before the 7.62x51mm FMJAP rounds that the MA5C unleashed on them. The goblins were quickly slaughtered as they had no chance to fire. The next group got lucky and unleashed bullets and bolts as well as their chemical weapons. However, those weapons proved to be nigh useless as the Spartan charged right at them at high speed. The only things the unfortunate goblins were able to see was their shots missing the Spartan as he moved too fast for their projectiles to hit him. Even the bullets from their guns didn't have the speed to hit the Spartan. They only saw a blur of movement and then they were all torn to shreds by the weapons of the Spartan. The Spartan quickly ran up and leaped over the goblins that were still alive and in mid-flip fired his remaining rounds in his assault rifle with deadly accuracy, and before he lands, he ejected the empty magazine and quickly loaded another one into the weapon. As soon as he landed, he quickly sprinted and unleashed another hail of bullets, choosing to use bursts for accuracy, and that worked effectively as several more of the goblins were cut down easily enough and he was not hit as of yet as the goblins were still reeling from his arrival and killing of their comrades with such speed. They had no idea what this thing was. It was human, but no human wore armor like this before and carry such weapons. They knew it was a gun, but it was not like any gun that they knew of at all. The Spartan quickly killed the next group and turned as a volley of grenade-like weapons finally smashed into him. In a moment his Mjolnir Mark VIS shields flickered gold as rock, dirt and shrapnel hit him, his temperature sensors spiked and dropped, while his shield gauge only had a small portion lost, a really tiny portion, showing that while the explosives were powerful, they were not enough to be harmful to him to say the very least. The laughter of the goblins at their success of finally hitting the Spartan 2 died out as the flames and smoke faded to reveal the giant being totally unharmed with flickering waves of golden energy all over his form. The goblin grenadiers recovered enough of their wits to reach in and fire, but the Spartan beat them to it and fired several rounds. But those rounds were not for them but for their weapons. The goblins never expected that as the rounds were able to cut through the metal casing of their weapons and detonate the explosives, resulting in the grenadiers being consumed by the explosions of their very own weapons. This was the opening the chief needed as he closed in and switched to his M7 SMGs. The two weapons unleashed a hail of bullets that was more than enough to reduce the goblins before him into bloody confetti as he moved in to slaughter them piecemeal. However, the next group decided to go all out and some of them took out packs of explosives and charged right at the Spartan. John spotted them and recognized their attacks as well as what they had on them. Suicide bombers. Right parenthesis. He was not unfamiliar with this tactic and quickly began to target the goblins with head and body shots. The built-in recoil dampeners and his Mjolnir kicking in to stabilize him to allow him to fire better while his HUDs quickly cycled through the threats, running a lot of calculations to allow him the best chance to hit his target's dead center. The goblins with the bombs died well enough but their deaths were not enough to slow down the other goblins as they attacked with their close combat weapons, hoping to overwhelm the being with their numbers and kill it despite the unknown armor. Many of them were not going to get the chance as they were cut down, though the last three, each armed with maces and short swords in both hands, attacked. However, the weapons bounced off the shields and the Spartan quickly terminated them with bursts of caseless rounds. He turned and spotted the orc overseer charging at him. He saw no identifying clan markings on the orc, meaning this one was a mercenary or hired hand for these goblins. That was when Cortana spoke to him. Chief, I've picked up several other signatures nearby a large group of living beings. And those three large ones that appear to be metal, they were at the back before, but now they are on the move towards your position. John nodded as he quickly fought with the orc as the creature tried to use a wicked-looking scimitar to try and gut the Spartan with a flurry of deadly strikes as he evaded the attacks. The orc's attacks managed to graze the shields but didn't cut it as the shield gauge didn't drop at all. The Spartan quickly placed the M7 SMGs on his thighs and quickly grabbed the scimitar and with cobra quick reflexes, ripped the weapon out of the hand of the orc and jammed it right into the orc's chest with such force that the blade bypassed the orc's heavy chainmail with frightening ease and the scimitar was buried all the way to the pommel and out the back. The Spartan moved away as the orc growled faintly as he dropped dead. That was then Cortana spoke. John, those three big contacts are coming right at you. The Spartan turned and sure enough, the three machines came out and were not facing the Spartan. Horizontal ellipsis. The pilots of the goblin shredders had tried to keep themselves out of sight as they saw that it was just one being and they thought that their fellow goblins could handle it. That all changed and now they were going to attack and kill this intruder. Once they killed it, they were going to take the remains back to the company and see if the mogul who led their company would reward them for such a find. Unfortunately, they were unaware that the pelican that had now landed had spotted them already and that allowed Cortana to analyze their shredders. The goblin shredder was a powerful tool of industry for the goblin race and was something that had been a bane to the night elves and the Tauren as they see its ability to deforest and despoil at an alarming rate as the ultimate sin to nature. The shredder was also a deadly weapon of war due to the armor plating and construction which was doubled by the massive steam saw it carried. All in all, this steam-driven monstrosity was the most effective tool the goblins of Venture Company as well as the rest of the goblin race. Unfortunately, the pilots of the three shredders, they were about to face a being who was more than able to hold his own. And compared to what the Master Chief had on, their shredders were nothing more than steam-driven junk piles which were soon destined for a trip to the great junk heap in the sky as it were. Cortana quickly scanned the three machines and spoke once she downloaded their exact design schematics. Those things seem to be driven by steam of all things, must be one heck of a boiler system they have there, and it has basic clockwork mechanisms to move it, fairly large ones considering the height and size of it. I don't see any serious weapons on it that can attack at range, so I'm wagering a guess that the giant saw blade is their only solid weapon, apart from the arm. I've managed to determine the metal construction to be steel mixed with bronze, tin, and iron, well built from the looks of it. But compared to the Mjolnir series of powered assault armor, they are serious outmatched. That was true. During the earlier stage of the Mjolnir's development, the progress had not been easy. The UNSC Navy developed the idea of a powered exoskeleton system that would not only help maneuver and move larger loads and materials, but also serve to augment the overall abilities of the said soldiers into combat while being armed with the best weapons, armor and sensors that could be used into the system. The first prototype, known as the Mark I, was developed in 2512 and took a decade to develop. However, it was bulky, unwieldy, took time to master, and worst of all, it relied on a cable connection to a fusion reactor to provide it power. Despite the advantages it gave, such as being able to lift 2 tons, run at a speed of 32 km per hour, armed with an advanced tactical computer, carrying all the best sensors at the time and carry heavy weapons. Only 40 units of the Mark I were built before they were cancelled and never saw combat in the field. Some were naturally relegated to lifting heavy loads and moving materials in docking bays, while others were dumped into the titanium mines on Reach. They were used by their trainers as well under Mendez's order, since several of the trainers were killed in hand-to-hand combat exercises by his fellow Spartans when they had arrived after they all had fully recovered from their augmentations. The Mark II was a slimmer profile and was less bulky. It also had a special coating that gave it considerable defense against heat, shrapnel and explosive energy, and had a special self-sealing system for operations in space. Despite these changes and advantages, the Mark II was still limited in terms of field applications as it still relied on a connection to a fusion reactor and was scrapped. The Mark III was the last attempt, and unlike the first 2 prototypes, it relied on transmitted power from a power station as it had a wireless power transmitter and receiver. While this had removed the need for it to be strapped to a power source, the Mark III was still rejected as it still had a limited operations range due to the transmitter system, as it needed to be in range of the reactor to be provided power. And the next was if the generator was taken out, the Mark II would be powerful regardless of whether it was in range or not. The idea of powered assault armor was placed aside for a very long time until Dr. Halsey took over the project and used new technologies that soon gave way the Mark VI that he wore. Even so, despite the fact that the Mark I, II, and III's were no longer in use, he had heard rumors of the UNSC Marines developing their own power armor system independent of the Mjolnir series. Comparing these things to even the Mark I was laughable at best, as despite the shortcomings of the Mark I, it was a powerful leap in technology, and these things were like bastardized versions of the Mark I all the way to the Mark III. Not only that, they were too large and bulky as well as being limited only to close combat roles. It was time to see just what these things were capable of apart from cutting down trees. Horizontal ellipsis. The Spartan quickly charged at the 3 shredders, firing his MA5C right at a selected target on the first shredder, while Kaylin, Jared, and Sandra looked on in shock, wondering if the human, if he was one, had lost his mind. The goblins who were piloting the shredders thought the same thing. One of them quickly attacked the Spartan as the Spartan fired his MA5C IWCS assault rifle at the shredder. The goblin was concentrating on the Spartan that he was unaware that those shots were not being fired at random. The Spartan had been aiming for the joints, and the shots had been used to weaken the joint with concentrated fire, and since the bullets fired from the MA5C were designed to pierce armor, they were moderately effective, as several holes now appeared on the joint of the arm with the steam saw. Just as the shredder pilot made a swing at the Spartan with the steam saw, the Master Chief quickly ducked under the attack, placed aside his assault rifle with blinding speed, and grabbed the arm. He then pulled in the Spartan's augmented strength, which had grown for the past 30 years and further boosted by the Mjolnir Mark VI, worked as the arm was ripped off while the blade was still spinning. The Spartan then swung the arm he had just torn off of the shredder with the blade spinning right into the goblin, who could only cry out in absolute fear as the blade tore him apart. This left the shredder without a pilot, as the Spartan then moved away from it as it slumped and fell forward with a massive groan. The second shredder was quickly on the offensive as the goblin pilot manipulated the controls to try and kill the Spartan with both hand and steam saw. But the Spartan quickly avoided both attacks and rolled under the shredder, and as soon as he was behind the machine, he quickly unleashed a pair of hard and fast kicks right at the back joints on the legs of the shredder. The strength of Spartans was never to be underestimated, as time and experience only made them stronger and deadlier. This was proven true as the legs of the second shredder gave way to the sheer force of the kicks on the Spartan. The shredder fell down unable to stand due to the critical damage to its legs. The goblin tried to escape from its now ruined machine, but the Spartan reached for a sharp shard of metal and with amazing precision threw it, and it buried itself deep in the throat of the goblin pilot just as he had finished crawling out and away from his machine and turned to look at the Spartan to shoot him with his gun. The goblin fell dead as the third and last surviving goblin guided the shredder cut down a tree and grabbed it with the other hand to use as a club. The goblin attacked with the weapon as the Spartan quickly leaped over the weapon and rushed on the tree right at the goblin, who then lashed out with the steam saw after dropping the tree. The attack however missed as the Spartan leaped forward and slammed his feet right into the chest of the shredder, and the impact was enough to actually put the shredder down flat on its back. The goblin cried out in utter shock as it felt like his shredder had been hit by a massive cannonball. It looked up and gave out a cry as the Spartan quickly smashed his fist into the goblin's face, reducing it into nothing but a bloody mess. In a few minutes, the battle was over as the Spartan looked over the battlefield to see the carnage before him. Horizontal ellipsis. As soon as the dust settles, the three night elves were utterly stunned by that they had just seen. The Spartan had fought with a goblin force nearly 36 strong in a trio of shredders and slaughtered them without even a single scratch to show for it. Kaelin and Jared had already seen the Spartan fight with an ogre and defeat it with seemingly no effort. But to see him take down 3 goblin shredders by himself was really something else, as they had never seen anyone who was alone take on even one and live to tell about it. As for Sandra, she was utterly impressed and decided to stick around a bit more to see this human, if he was one, in action. She herself had no love for the venture company of goblins and had fighting encounters with them more than once in her travels, and seeing them being punished by the Spartan was very nice. The Master Chief then looked around and spotted what appeared be a number of beings that were being held in chains. No doubt that they were slaves from the looks of it, and no doubt were the other contacts that Cortana had detected along with the ones the orc might have been watching over before it attacked him. Cortana confirmed it as well as she called to him via COM system. He wasted no time scanning for any living wounded goblins and putting them out of their misery. He reached the slaves and was surprised to find a rather unique variety of species being held prisoner. Some were humans, some young teens of both genders, as well as a trio of old men, along with a small number of beings that resembled the night elves but seemed to have pale skin, almost like a human skin tone. And the last were a number of beings that seemed to be elvish but human-like at the same time. Naturally, the looks directed to him by the slaves was abject fear and shock. No doubt seeing him slaughter their captors in such a fashion would have made quite the impression on the people, and seeing this being of such brutal destruction walking to them was shocking, as they had no idea what he was going to do to them. Was he going to kill them all just as he killed the goblins? Or would he do much worse to them? The Spartan had no idea what to make of this as he came closer to the apparent slaves and then took up one of the chains that held the slaves and tore the metal chains easily, much to the amazement of the slaves. And their awe increased even more so as the Spartan suddenly spoke to them in common. "Don't be alarmed, I'm not here to hurt you, give me a minute to free all of you." The slaves nodded as the Spartan quickly began to remove the chains and allowed them to stand up. As the slaves got up from the ground where they had been earlier since the whole battle, he scanned them. He could see slash wounds from knives, lash marks that were similar to wounds inflicted by whips. There were also bruises, no doubt from clubs or fists. The sight of this kind of abuse angered the Spartan, and he decided that these people were in no condition to be traveling about in Kalimdor. There were still predators about, and also there was no telling what other threats were out there. One of the humans then spoke in a tired and feeble voice. Who are you? What are you? You can call me Chief, sir. As to what I am a human like you, but different. The others were stunned by this, especially the elves and those who were showing both human and elf traits, as the old man spoke once more. Human? You are human? That is, wait, you said you were different as well. What did you mean by that? I am a Spartan. The slaves tried to ask for more answers. But they were not going to get any more answers from the Master Chief, as he decided that until they had fully recovered from their ordeal under those creatures described by his night elf companions as goblins, they were under his protection. He turned to the 3 and gently called to them in a firm tone of command. Kaelin, Jared, Sandra, I need your help. The night elves moved to the group, and though they were not happy with the high elves, even they were not going to let their own grievances with the high elves stop them from helping them. And the high elves were still too tired and weakened to care all that much, as they were still looking at their savior with some confusion and awe. Horizontal ellipsis. Later. The Master Chief was tired as he sat down on a chair in one of the rooms of the Dawn. It had been hard and it was already reaching night time. He and the 3 night elves had been busy watching over the new arrivals, as they were now currently resting in one of the crew's quarters. It had taken some prodding to get the slaves to go into the dawn and some more prodding to keep them from trying to touch anything that would be dangerous to them. Cortana naturally locked down all the critical sections of the ship to keep the people from entering restricted areas. He had made sure that the men and women were in separate rooms when they were going to go to sleep as to make sure no hijinks happened on his watch. They had been given a chance to get cleaned and showed in one of the sections used by the crews for bathing, with the men and women naturally taking two different areas for privacy. They also had been provided clean towels which the Spartan had brought to them. The people were naturally happy and bathed to their heart's content, which was told to the Spartan by Cortana, who told John that she had scanned them and suggested that they get proper medical treatment after they had a good meal. As soon as they were done bathing and drying themselves up, they were given clothes, simple tank top shirts which were colored gray and white, as well as comfortable pants and boots, all military-issued clothing. While those clothes were ordinary and plain by UNSC standards, the slaves were utterly thankful, as these were improvements for their filthy rags and torn clothing, all of which they were more than happy to throw away. They were soon brought to the mess halls, and after a bit, they saw the tables and chairs and got the idea of the place that they were now in. The group was then allowed to reach the food dispenser, and when they began to get their food on trays, as John and Cortana had managed to get the place operational earlier, the former slaves were more than willing to dive in the food that was provided to them by the Spartan, and that troubled the Spartan somewhat, as he was worried that his ship's supplies of MREs might run out before long. But Sandra was able to help out by leaving the dawn and coming back a few hours later after hunting down a pair of deer, and brought them back, with Kaylin helping her friend. As soon as the deer were brought in, the Spartan had them dressed and cooked in the Dawn's large area for the other crew members of the frigate, with Cortana helping there with the process, speeding up the cooking of the meat while not compromising the taste and freshness of the meat. After both animals were cooked to perfection, the food was brought there to the people with it in slices. The smell of well-cooked venison had been a welcome thing for the former slaves, as they ate their food with gusto. After the large meal, those with injuries were guided by John to the medical bay, and while some were frightened by the machines, unaware of their nature, the Spartan was able to treat their wounds well enough and soon had them resting. Though he made sure to get DNA samples for Cortana to study, he made sure to get DNA from the elves and the ones who had the elven and human features as well for study. This was due to the fact that he wanted to have more information about the species there on this world, and having DNA to work with would really help. Cortana also decided to take her time to study the DNA samples to make sure that she had all of her bases covered, so to speak. As for the Spartan, he now had an MRE and decided to eat the meal while thinking about the events of the day. He knew that the ruined bodies of the goblins would be useful in gathering a DNA sample as well, though he decided that he would have to do it later, as the bodies were still going to take a while to decompose. He needed to make sure that he knew just what these goblins were and determine if there were key weaknesses he can exploit apart from the regular kinds of weaknesses. He then turned to see none other than Kaylin and Sandra. Jared had left earlier to report to Tyrant, and the two were the only ones here. As they sat down and seemed to be in conversation, he decided to focus on other matters. The first thing he needed to do was to gather samples of the weapons used by the goblins, and also get the shredders. The fact that the goblins were using such things in a world where technology is supposed to be in its infancy was very interesting. Cortana naturally wanted to know more about these devices and see if there was anything that they were able to use. As night continued to press on, the Master Chief decided to get some time in keeping an eye on the ship while the freed slaves rested. Afterwards, he would ask if Kaylin and her friend would be able to fill in when he also would need some sleep. He might be a Spartan 2 commando and a 30-year veteran of wars, but even he needed sleep like the next man. Horizontal ellipsis. Tyrant watched the images with a look of appreciation, as she had no love for the goblins' profiteering ways and utter disregard to nature and the balance of life, and she was happy that they had been dealt with. She also had to admit that seeing the Spartan free the slaves without caring for their race was a warming sight to her, as Jared showed the images through the large orb of druidic magic that he had conjured up to show the events that had just happened when the Spartan had finally left Darnassus. She had not expected him to be fighting so early in the day, but that was to be expected from someone like him. As the images faded away, she smiled a bit more and decided to send a message to the Spartan, and took out a scroll and began to write down the message, and as soon as the message was completed, she turned to Jared and spoke to him. Jared, there is something that I need from you. Name it, High Priestess. I need you to send this message to Chief and inform him that the best course of action for him with the matter of the slaves is to go to Theramore Isle and meet with Lady Jaina Proudmoore. Tell him that she will be more than able to help with the matter, and if he desires more answers to his questions, then Lady Jaina can provide them to the best of her abilities. Jared nodded at that and answered, I shall do my best to convey your message, High Priestess. I thank you. I will also send word to Jaina to expect the Spartan and his guests. I would also like it if you inform Kaelin and Sandra to join up the Spartan to lend their aid if he requires it while he is in our lands. The druid nodded as he decided to head back the dawn to convey the message of the High Priestess to the Spartan. As soon as the druid left, Tyrion turned to look at the statue of the first High Priestess of her people's faith, and she thought of the Night Elf women who had taken the position that she had now. What would you have done, sisters? What would you have done in my place, and learning what you have learned from this man? Tyrion stood up and looked at the moon and thought even more about what she had learned about the Spartan. To think that there are humans beyond this planet, beyond any world we know of, who could do such things, travel beyond their world, create such massive cities, yet be able to live with the land and nature well, populate entire worlds, develop such things, command such forces as they do, wield such weapons. They owned an empire that spanned nearly 1,000 worlds. If the Alliance heard of this and saw the technology the Spartan commanded, they would hound the Spartan for the rest of his life. They would do anything to get their hands on it. Right. Tyrion thought about the implications if the Alliance got their hands on such technology. It was very difficult to imagine. This was why she decided that the Spartan would be placed under her people's protection, and show that he was to be left alone. She had to admire the Spartan's wish to be left in peace and be allowed to be given the chance to leave this world on his own terms. She had thought that he would give his technology to his fellow humans when given the chance, in order to give them a chance to reach the level of technology that his people had. However, she recalled his reply to that when she brought it up. Horizontal ellipsis. Flashback. I will not let that happen. This technology is too dangerous for anyone else to have. Really, I thought that as a fellow human, you would be willing to give a lending hand to your fellow humans. I am human, High Priestess Tyrande, but just because I am human does not mean that I will just give away what I know willingly. This world is not ready for such technology, and giving it will only bring imbalance to the rest of the world, and without any knowledge on how to understand basics, the results would never turn out well for everyone. The history of humanity where I come from has accounts of technology being introduced to cultures unprepared for it, and I am not going to be responsible for an event that will result in a disaster. This technology will remain with me for as long as needed. Horizontal ellipsis. End of flashback. Tyrion smiled a bit more at that, as she had been able to sense that he was not lying, to say the very least, and she couldn't help but think about all that had happened. She moved to the nearby window and looked at the moon, and then she thought of Malfurion, and she smiled at the memory of her beloved and wondered how he would have reacted towards the Spartan if they were to meet. The High Priestess then decided that she needed to rest. She knew that in a few days' time, the annual meeting with the representatives of the Alliance were going to come and have a discussion on